Today's daf is daf Samach Zayin, and let's just review what we know before we start with Boy Rava, which is where we left off yesterday. And what we do know is that Gilgul Hegdesh is poter. So in the midst of Chala, the Machayev of Chala is Gilgul Isa. And if it was done by the Gizbar of Hegdesh, then there's no Chiv Chala. That much we know. And that's going to lead into Rava's suffix, Rava's vacillation. But before we get to that, let's just mention what was simple and certain according to Rava. And in the case of Maser, if you have a Meruach, which is called the Gemar Malacha, that's the winnowing and the smoothing it out in the Kri of Hegdesh, then halacha is your potter from Maser. If, let's say, an Akum, a non-Jew, did the Meruach, then we have a Machlokas Tanoim. We have Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda on one side, and they hold that Yechayev in Maser, whereas Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon on the other side say that you're potter from Maser because just like the Gilgul Isa of an Akum in just 1 second. We're not ready for Gilgul Isa and Akum. First of all, we have to talk about Gilgul Isa in Hegdesh is potter from Chala. So too, Gemar Malacha or Meruach, according to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, in the case of Maser, is also potter from Maser. So again, if you're talking about the Gilgul of Hegdesh for the Chi of Chala, then everybody agrees that it's potter. But if you're talking about the Chiyuv or lack thereof of Maser, which is generated by Meruach, if it was done by an Akum, then we have Machlokas Tanoim. Boy Rava wants to know Gilgul Ovikachavimai. Although we know that Gilgul Hegdesh certainly is potter from Chala, we don't know about Gilgul Ovikachavim, because in the case of Maser we had two Tanoim, and that's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who are of the opinion that in the case of Meruach Akum, there's a Chiyuv Maser. So here's where Rava is going to try to analyze this question about Chala in terms of Gilgul Akum, based on a Mishnah in Masechta Chala. Mishnah Tanan, we have learned in the Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah is going to go through a number of different scenarios with regard to the chiyuv of chala or lack thereof. The first scenario is Gershon is Gaiva Hoisalo Isa, means that the Gilgul Isa was done by this ger, but before he was misgayer. So it's a case of Gilgul Ovdei Kochavim, which is exactly what Rava had vacillated about. And that's called Nasa Ad Shalom Nisgayer Potter. That since the Gilgul was done before the Gerus, and therefore he was a guy at the time of the Gilgul, therefore it's not Chayiv and Chala. But Mishan is Gayer, obviously, if after his Gerus was complete and he's a full-fledged Jew, and now he did the Gilgul Isa, certainly he's Chayiv Chala. And the only reason I think the Mishnah mentions this is because now it's going to, having set the bounds of what is definitely either potter or definitely chayav, suffix, now we're ready for a suffix where he doesn't know whether or not the Gilgul was done before his gerus or after his gerus. In that case, chayav. Now, what does that mean, chayev? Chayev means that we have here a suffix isur because if indeed he's chayev in challah, then if a non-Kohen would eat from that challah without afrosha, he incurs a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. However, if the Kohen comes along now and he says, "Give me the challah," then we can apply the principle of hamotzi mechavel varaya, and the burden of proof is on the shoulders of the Kohen to prove that in fact Gilgul Akum is Chai. I'm sorry, to prove in fact that the Gilgul had taken place after the Gerus. Haman Katanila. Now the assumption is that even though we had two Tanoim, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who were machmir in the case of Meruach Akum to be mechayev in Maser, but nevertheless, here in the case of Chala, with regard to Gilgul al Yedei Akum, meaning before the ger was Miskayer, is Divrei Akol, Va'afilu Rabbi Meir of Rabbi Yehuda, the mechayev Hosam, even though Rabbi Meir Yehuda hold in the case of Maser that the Meruach of a guy does in fact generate a chiyuv maser and a shem tevel, but here patri hacha. But the case of Chala is different, and the Gilgul Isa of the guy, like we had the case of Gilgul Isa of Hegdesh, is potter from Chala. And why do we differentiate between Maser as far as the Meruach of an Akum, which is Mechayv according to these Tanoim, as opposed to the Chala in the Gilgul of the Akum? Hasam hu dechsiv. Now the Gemara is going to operate with a principle called Ribui achar Ribui I'm sorry, Miut achar Miut lerab. So if you have a double miut, it comes as a Ribui. That's one of the rules of biblical exegesis, Dichsiv, and there's a double ribui in the case of Maser, Degoncha, twice it says the word Degoncha. Actually, it says it three times, but one is just to tell you Degoncha, and the other two is a ribui, and that ribui should be marbe, should be, I'm sorry, once again, I'm confusing Shiribu and Miut. Right, the Goncha is a Miut, and now we have that Miut twice, and that's going to indicate each Miut in and of itself. If there was only one Miut, would indicate that the Meruach V'Nakum does not generate a Chiv Maser. Yisera, the second the Goncha, which is totally superfluous, Havi Miut Achar Miut. So we have a double Miut of the Goncha, which, again, if it would have been one meter, would have told me that the meruach of an akum is potri maser, but ein mirach amira l'rabos afilu avikol chavim. The sheet of, again, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir is that the meruach of an akum generates a chiyuv maser aval hach. But here, in the case of chala, we don't have that third extra one, and each one of the two arisosechems is necessary. Chad arisosechem kidei arisosechem, to tell you the shear of dough of 43 and a third beitzim of the isa of the dough to be mechayv chala. The chad arisosechem v'lo isas ovikachavim v'lo isas hegdesh. So the other arisosechem is going to exclude, in the case of chala, the gilgul of an ovikochavim, and that's something that even Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree. Meaning, even though Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, again for the third time, will say that the meruach of akum does in fact generate a chiv maser and a shem tevel chiv maser, but here in the case of gilgul, with regard to chala. And again, there doesn't seem to be any logical distinction between Chala and Maser. It's just a question of Gzeres HaKosim, what we derive from the Psukim. Here we're going to derive from the Psukah Risosechem to the exclusion of Isas Akum. O Dilma, Now Rav explains the other side in his suffix. Dilma Rab Yossi Rab Shimon Ketonila. Maybe we should say that the Mishnah that says that the Gilgul of an Akum is Potur from Chala is only according to Rab Yossi and Rab Shimon, who hold that the Meruach of an Akum is Potur from Maser. To Kapa'afal Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, maybe they would say, Gamri, Rashis Mihosam, whatever applies in Maser, ipso facto applies in Chala. There's an absolute equation between Maser and Chala. Why? Because we have Gzera Shava of Rashis. So it means that in Dvarim, Perek Yud Ches, with regard to Maser, it says Rashis. And in Bamidbar Perek Tesvav, with regard to Chala, it says Rashis. And Exer Shava teaches me that whoever is Mechayev in Maser, ipso facto is Mechayev in Chala. And therefore, Rameir Yehuda hold that the Meruach of an Akum is Mechayev, and Maser would hold that the Gilgul Isa of an Akum is Mechayev in Chala. So from Maser, we derive Chala. Omar Rava, Yehi Rav, I wish Hashem would achvi bechelma. He would like send a dream to my mind, and then I would know the answer to this question. And Hadar Amar Rava, and Rava actually apparently thought it out, and God gave him an insight, and he came to the conclusion that man diyom meruach ovikochom poter is gilgal ovikochom poter, uman diyom meruach ovikochom eno poter is gilgal ovikochom eno poter. Meaning the old machlokas between the Tanoim in Meruach Akum with regard to Maser will apply likewise, each one L'shitaso, with regard to Gilgul of an Akum in Chala. And now the Gemara is going to object to Rava's final conclusion with two different objections. The first one's from Rav Papa. Eisvei Rav Papa Rava Ove Kol Chav. I have a brayso that says that Goy Shehifish Peter Chamor. Right, there's halach of Petach Hamor that the firstborn male offspring of a donkey has to be redeemed with a sheep or a goat, and that's a parsha in Shmos, Parshas Bo, Perek Yud Gimel. And now this ger was mafrish a sheep for his Petach Hamor while he was a goy before his gerus. V'chala, or for example, he was mafrish chala before his conversion when he was still an akum. And in these two cases, Modino, so we notify him, shehu potter, that since his Petach Hamor or his Hafrashas Chal was implemented while he was a guy, therefore he's potter. Now, so far at this point, I don't see any proof one way or the other, Gabi Rava's conclusion. But let's go on. We should notify him that even though he was mafresh challah, but as a guy who was mafresh challah, he can give it to a non-kohen to eat. It's not challah. Petach Hamor goes is v'yovibo. Even though Petach Hamor has a certain kedusha to it for an iser gizav avoda, here that iser is not incurred. Now this line over here, Petach Hamor goes is v'yovibo, is a very problematic line. Just for your own edification, because even if the chamor, the bchar, was owned by a Jew at the time that it was born, it would still be aser begizav avoda until it was redeemed. This particular chamor is mutter because it belonged to a guy at that time. And here the Brisa speaks about being mafresh, and the sheep that was used to redeem the chamor was already separated. It must be referring to the donkey itself, because the sheep is permitted for benefit in any event, even if the owner was a Jew. So we're talking about hafrasha of the donkey. Anyway, what's the diuk that Rav Papa is medayik from this brisa and throws it as an objection to Rava? Ha trumaso, asura. If we were dealing with not, just one second, not challah but truma, just one second. Why does he assume that challah excludes truma? That's what I don't know. Challah and truma are almost identical. One second. Okay, so that bothers me, but we have to go on. I don't know why the diuk here of Rav Papa is that challah neseres l'zarim, necheles. I said neseres necheles l'zarim, but truma would not be necheles l'zarim. And now the diuk of Rav Papa leads Rav Papa to the conclusion that we're dealing with a doraisa here. Oh, I understand. Now, sorry. I figured this out this morning and I forgot it. You go through the same mistakes again. The word truma here is a reference to not just truma, but also to maser. We've been discussing maser all the time, but maser and truma are identical. And therefore, this brisa of Rav Papa is implying a distinction, a contrast between challah and maser, or maser truma. And that means that with regard to trumas and masros, if he did meruach while he was in akum before his gerus, then asura, it would be asur. The only reason it's mutter here is because we're talking about challah. So therefore, Papa says, "V'hahai tana diom meruach ovikochav meino poter." So we see in challah through this diuk. I'm sorry, we see in maser through this diuk that the meruach of an akum is not a poter because we medayik that in the case of trumas and masros asura, even though he did the Meruach before his Gerus, the Gilgal of Kachom Potter, and yet it says here explicitly that Chal and Echelis Lizorim, because his Gilgal, while he was a guy, potters him up. And that's why we notify the Ger that he doesn't have to worry about the Chal, he can give it to a whatchamacallit, to a non-Kohen. So we see clearly against Rava, because Rava wanted to say that if you hold Meruach Ovei Kochavim Eino Poter, then you would hold that Gilgal Ovei Kochavim Eino Poter, right? That was the suffix of Rava, about Gilgal Ovei Kochavim. Rava's conclusion was, well, if the Meruach of an Ovei Kochavim Eino Poter, then the Gilgal Eino Poter. But if on the other hand, the Meruach is a Poter, then Gilgal will also be a poter. And here we're saying, no, there's a distinction between Maser and Chala. That was the first kasha on Rava. And this is going to lead Rava to revamp his whole sheet and say that there's a whole derabanan going on over here. Eisvei Ravina, now Ravina takes over for a papa, and he has a kasha from a different brisa. And the brisa says the Chalas Oved Kol Chavim Ba'aretz. Okay, now all mitzvahs hatlios ba'aretz apply only in Eretz Yisrael, not outside Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the challah of an oved kol chavim, even in Eretz Yisrael, utrumaso, and it's truma bechutz laaretz, because apparently truma was.
Okay, so the kitzur, you probably prefer
Utrumaso bechutz laaretz, modino soshu potter. And what does that mean? It means that chaloso nechels zarim, utrumaso ena midamas. Okay, midamas means if the truma got mixed up with chulin, normally that truma would create an iser with the chulin, but here Since we're talking about an akum, therefore his truma is not truma. So the Gemara is medayik. This is Ravina. It says over here that truma so bechutz la'aretz. Since truma is drabanan, we can be making, and therefore we're going to say that his truma could be eaten by a non-Kohen. That's only in chutz la'aretz. Ha truma so ba'aretz hasura u'medamas. So we see clearly that as far as truma is concerned, well, it's asura, which means that we're holding now that meruach, I'm sorry, that gilgul akum eno poter. Says Ravina, for high time at Yomi ruach akum eno poter. Okay, I was on the mark. Is gilgul ovikachom poter? Nevertheless, gilgul ovikachavim. Right, because it says chalas ovikachom ba'aretz. Ba'aretz means that we're dealing with doraisa for sure. I think there's even one Madhyama that says chalas chutzlar is doraisa, but we don't hold like that. But here, right, what we're telling him, that that chalosu nechel zarim. So if chalos and nechel zarim, then we're obviously holding the gilgul akum is potter, and yet we were medayik that truma in Eretz Yisrael from the akum is chayav, which means that we're holding that may, and again truma equals maser, and we're holding that meruach ovikol may no poter, and guess gilgul ovikol poter against that's against Rava. And here's where Rava is going to revamp his whole shita midarabanan. When the Brisa says that the truma of an akum is what is truma in Eretz Yisrael. That was at diuk. That's only midrabanon, because midaraisa, just like we're holding that gilgul akum is a poter, so too meruach of an akum is a poter on a deraisa level is no chiyuv maaser. But the Rabbanan made a gzeira. What was the gzeira? Mishum bali kisa. Right, there's these wealthy people that have large volumes of mass. So they don't want to give mass. So they look for a subterfuge way of not having to give maser. So what they're going to do, they're going to be makne their tvua to an akum. They're going to tell the akum, you go ahead and do meruach for me, and then I'll get it back from you. I'll pay you a little fee for that, And now it's potter from maser. So the rich people are going to save themselves a bomb of money. They don't have to give the Levi. The Levi is in trouble now. He doesn't get maser. So therefore, the Chacham made a gzera that if the akum goes ahead and does the meruach, it's still chayiv in maser, even though on a deraisa level it's potter from maser.